Welcome to Podcast to Connect. If you are using a podcast or want to use a podcast to find your people and make connections with them, whether it be for business or community purpose, then this is the place for you. Hi, I'm Steph from Coffee Like Media, and I've been podcasting for quite a while. And I have definitely grown my community and my business, both from podcasting as well as supporting mediums like newsletters and YouTube channels. And we'll talk all about that, don't worry. But I wanted to share some of the things that I have learned throughout the years, as well as some of the conversations I'm having with people about the different things we're doing to connect to folks in the podcasting space and what glorious things come out of those connections. In this first season, I'm repurposing episodes from earlier versions of Podcast to Connect, one of which was a 30-day experience called National Podcast Post Month, where a bunch of editors came on to the podcast and gave tips and advice on how to maneuver your podcast to sound good. And then it grew from there into more of the connective and outreach and community focus of podcasting. I've taken a smattering of both of those flavors, and here are 11 of those that I think give you a variety, a bouquet, a rainbow, shall we say, of different tips that I think will help your business or community podcast. If you need help with your podcast, feel free to reach out to me at coffeelikemedia.com. All right, let's get on with today's tip. So let's dive into my favorite question first. What's the goal of Beyond the Thesis?
The goal of Beyond the Thesis is to shed light on what happens after graduate school professionally to 80% of people. Because, and I discovered this way after I finished my PhD, only 20% of people at most who go through a PhD have a spot to be a tenured professor later on. So what happens to the other 80%? And
right.
And this is why week after week I get people here that either dropped out of PhD, like your story. This week, it's funny. This week's episode is Kate Dahl. You probably know her, who's also in Denmark. Yeah.
Oh my God, she's amazing. I met her at an event like my second week in Copenhagen.
Really?
That's crazy. Oh my gosh.
She's talking about reinventing yourself. She also dropped out of the PhD for different reasons than you did. Yes.
That's amazing.
So, and again, I want to normalize these paths. I want to normalize these journeys.
Yeah.
And I want to kind of showcase the variety and also the passion that people have for their jobs and whatever they build for themselves professionally after graduate school, which often there's this idea of, oh, if you leave academia, it's going to be boring, it's going to be unstimulating, and it's actually going to be less noble than staying the path and going to research. So that's it. That's the idea, is to help people who are in this mire of, oh, I'm not going to be a professor. What happens now?
And this is the follow-up to that, what's the goal of the podcast question that I love the most, is what do you want your listeners to do after they listen to an episode?
If I resume it to one thing, and then maybe I'll add one or two, but one thing is start networking today. And I'm not saying networking like go find a job by being aggressive on LinkedIn. No, it's start nurturing relationships with people that are a little bit outside of your circle, and then a little bit farther and a little bit farther. And then in 3 years, when the time comes to get a job, you'll have a great network of people who might or might not have a job for you, but who may think of you when someone they know does need someone.
Yep. It's interesting that you say that. It is so interesting that you say that, because I just had a conversation on an online forum of podcast editors, and there's somebody who has like 20 years of, audio engineering experience, and they're coming into the podcasting world and they're like, how do I find clients? And I'm like, have you told the people you've worked with in the audio space what you're doing now? And he's like, no. Like, there you go. You already have a network. Like, people think they always have to approach strangers to network. But a lot of times you can reach out to people you know and just tell them. And then if they know people who might, they'll hear stuff and they'll recommend you and so on and so forth.
Yeah, especially if you have, like you said, if you have 20 years of a past career behind you, don't dismiss it. It's it's something that belongs to you, and that you're missing an opportunity if you just chuck it and discard it completely.
Exactly. We are whole people. We are not just the last thing we did.
I love it. I love that. Yes.
Yeah. And this is especially true in PhD, where you literally are when you enter the program you're in. And it's like, no, I'm really we went into this a lot on the episode with, that we did on your podcast with me. Yeah. But let's get to connections. So how have your listeners reached out to you? What are the methods they use?
There's different ways. One of the things, and it's funny because it feels like I should ask LinkedIn for a sponsorship, because I talk about them a lot of
you should.
So well, maybe let's talk about that, of how to do that. But
okay.
A lot of what I've done in the last years is to, for example, start like you live recording on these platforms. So using StreamYard also to be on LinkedIn when I record my episodes, and also on YouTube. But on LinkedIn, people see the episodes or see part of it or see the shorts that I post, and then they connect and they say, I just found out about your podcast. I find it really inspiring. I have some questions for you. So that's one way they reach out.
Okay.
In the last year, my provider, my hosting provider for the podcast, Blueberry, developed a survey that's hosted on Blueberry that you can use to get to know your audience. And there's one little spot there where there's comments, and people have been the people who have answered have left comments that are actually touching and inspiring. One of them has said, your podcast was my company during the last stretch of my PhD, things like that. Yeah, I was like, my heart melted completely when I read that.
That's amazing. I love that.
So but then I don't know what's your experience, but other organic contacts from the audience is very sparse or even inexistent. Like, people have seldom on Twitter, or sometimes on Instagram people do, but really the LinkedIn and this survey that I kind of promote on the episode on and that people say, I'll do that for David. I'll go fill in the survey. Apart from that, there hasn't been that many people that have reached out. Because listeners are kind of invisible to us who create a podcast. But I wanted to try and get my audience to nominate the podcast to the People's Choice Podcast Awards, and I got on the slate. I got nominated. So it wasn't messages per se, but the fact that they went and put in their vote and got me nominated is another way that I felt their pulse, which I hadn't up till now. So being a creator, it's depending on the platform you're on and the format. It's not easy to be sure that you're going to get direct contact from the audience. I don't know what your experience has been.
It's been similar. I think that's why I got so obnoxious about newsletters and YouTube and all of these live events, because just in the apps itself, there's so little ability to contact anybody. Like, you can write show notes. You can write the most amazing show notes known to man, and very few people actually look at them. I actually look at them and I tell people, hey, I can't find your stuff in here. I need to contact. It took me like 5 minutes to find you. Like, why are you doing this to your listeners? But in general, most people don't look at them. Yeah. So it's frustrating, and that's why I really like the other ways. Like, you have a newsletter too, right?
Yes, I do. It's not huge in terms of the number of listeners, but a weekly newsletter that I'm improving on. Yeah. It's been, and actually with some AI tools that have developed in the last year or so, I've been able to make it better and better, because again, this is, like you were saying, I'm doing it all. I'm doing the producing, the scheduling, and also the promoting, and you know how.
In addition to your day job, But when you look down, and you literally did this, David, it's not big. It doesn't need to be. You're talking to people who dropped out of a PhD program. Yeah. Do you know how small that is in the world? I mean,
it's true.
Of course, it's not going to be gigantic. It's not. Your total potential population isn't gigantic.
Yeah.
So,
which goes to a very important point, I think, for current small businesses today, which is to niche.
Exactly. Yeah. And it's more about the connections and the projects and collaborations that come from it later, more so than the sheer numbers. Now, we can't compare ourselves to networks. They have hundreds of people working on one podcast. I mean, that's an impossible task.
Exactly.
Impossible comparison.
It's just a plan to be disappointed. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's just not fair. It's just a very different creature. There's nothing wrong with their podcast. There's nothing wrong with our podcasts. They're just very, very, very different. So yeah, that definitely is a similarity from educational podcasts like yourself to the small business folks. It's not about numbers. I mean, you can use your downloads to gauge trends, but you're never going to be like in the top 10.
Of course. Yeah, no. It's not. Yeah. If you start thinking about that, and sometimes, people do when they start a podcast project, and then it's just, they're shooting themselves in the foot because it's an impossible mission.
It's hard because a lot of the podcast information out there is about the top guys.
Yeah.
And so it's hard because you don't know where else to look for information that's relevant to you. So for smaller folks, it's a bit more of a dig. Yeah. But okay, if you're thinking of the future, David, like what connections would you like to make with your podcast and all of its supporting mediums in the future that you haven't made yet? Someone or some organization you would love to collaborate with or even just connect with and have a conversation with that is connected to the podcast in some way.
Someone, and I've had the luck of already meeting some people that I admire and that are
nice.
It's funny. I when I was finishing my PhD, I was hours and hours in the microscope room in the dark and listening to this podcast called This Week in Science.
Yeah.
And after, I think in the second year of the podcast, I got the courage to write to the main, to the creator of the show. Yeah. And she came on the show. But for the future, some people that inspire me in the podcast space right now, and he's not exclusively in the podcast space, but he has a cool podcast that I like, which is called A Bit of Optimism, is Simon Sinek. I don't know if you know of him. He's the one who wrote Find Your Why. And he's very well known for his TED Talk about that. So, talking about people, that would be really cool. Someone that I really enjoy listening to, and the fact that, he's a scientist and he's so good at communicating, is Neil deGrasse Tyson. I'd love to.
Heck yeah. Whose list isn't he on? He's amazing. I love how honest he is when he answers questions too. It's like, I'm not going to be too formal about this.
Yeah, he has all this knowledge behind his thinking, but he can talk just so normally and so accessibly. And then there's some people with a PhD profile, but also a very large audience profile, like Mayim Bialik, who was on Big Bang Theory, and now has a great podcast on mental health. And because mental health is also something I love to cover on Beyond The Thesis, but I'll put it in there in the universe as a dream team or a wish list. But these people are very busy, and
oh my gosh, can I be your producer when you do that episode with her? I would love you. She's amazing.
Isn't
she? Gosh, her Instagram, like just the content and the rawness and the honesty and the wisdom that she has is just crazy.
And then for me, go ahead. I was just going to say that for me, considering that she has a PhD in neuroscience, which is really close to what I did. I'd really want to hear her story of transition into the different spaces, from a young star to then a student to then a researcher to then a star again.
Have you asked her yet?
Well, I have reached her agent, and then I got gatekeeped out of reaching her. Gosh. But first try.
We'll see what we can do. I'm going to take this clip and see what I can, as if I have connections. Yeah, we'll see what I can do. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Podcast to Connect. I'll have all of the information in the show notes or video notes, depending on where you are consuming this. Again, Podcast to Connect is available in audio and video format. And if you need any help with your podcast, feel free to reach out at coffeelikemedia.com. Thanks so much. Bye.